Hi, KCA. Today we are going to be reading The Secret of the Old Desk. And last week, or maybe it was even 2 weeks ago, we read from the same book about Johnny Reb. And your moms or dads would have read that to you. And this one goes along with it, but it's going to start off with Billy Yank. So obviously, Johnny Reb was talking about the experience of the Southerners, and Billy Yank, since the Southerners called the Northerners Yankees, is going to talk about the North. So Gettysburg, 1861 to 1863. Billy Yank went to war no less confidently than Johnny Reb, gaily singing, "We'll hang Jeff Davis to a sour apple tree." Billy grabbed his musket and claimed that he would take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia in 90 days and reunite the Union. At the same time that Lincoln was morally opposed to slavery, he believed as president that his primary duty was to preserve the Union. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he said. Near Bull Run, a small creek in northeastern Virginia, on July 21st, 1861, Billy Yank suffered his first rude awakening. At first, the Yankees, trying to turn to the left wing of the rebel army, believed that the North had gained the victory. But throughout the early fighting, Stonewall Jackson's brigade never budged from the hill it held. Then, reinforced, Jackson's brigade charged. The Yankees reeled back in disorder, their casualties mounted to about 2,800 against 2,000 for the Confederates, and the supposed victory turned into dismal defeat. Bull Run taught Billy Yank a new tune. The war would be neither short nor easy for either side. The South was full of fight, and its generals were capable. Before the final surrender at Appomattox in 1865, 2,667,000 men would fight for the North, and 110,000 would die in action or of wounds, while another 250,000 would die of disease or starvation. The Confederate enlistments would number 1,400,000. Their dead in action or from wounds, 75,000. And their dead from disease or starvation, 90,000. So let me show you. Here's the picture of the Confederates. You can tell because of the flag. That's the flag of the Northern Virginia Army. And let me show you this picture before I read the page. To no one more than to the man who lived in the White House was this reality a sad blow, the price unduly severe. From month to month, at times from hour to hour, the melancholy deepened in Lincoln. Gravely he labored as commander-in-chief to find a general who could lead the North to victory and thus preserve the Union. The first choice for the supreme commander had been a Virginian, but Robert E. Lee could not fight against his native state. In one of the loneliest, most heartfelt rides in his history, Lee rode across the bridge from Washington to Arlington, Virginia, making the reluctant choice. The general Lincoln needed indeed existed, but it took a long time to find the man who, as a young second lieutenant, had so much admired the fighting style of Zachary Taylor. Meanwhile, before Grant emerged as the man who could win, heartbreak mounted for Lincoln as he padded around the White House at night in carpet slippers. Could you imagine what it would be like to be the president leading your country into war and having so many die and not knowing who could successfully lead them to victory? So he's padding around at night in the White House. He can't sleep because it's so stressful. In a church in Washington during the war, there was a little room off the chapel. Sometimes, during prayer meetings, the door to the room stood ajar, but no one was allowed near the room, and whether or not the room was occupied remained a mystery. Then, one winter's night, a boy followed the footprints in the snow from the door that led from room to yard, so he knew the secret of where, some evenings, Lincoln could be found. The spiritual strength in Lincoln was enormous, and surely he had need for every bit of such strength he could muster after the saddening Bull Run. The Peninsular Campaign under General George B. McClellan in 1862 ended in failure instead of the capture of Richmond. Under General John Pope, the North suffered a second disastrous defeat at Bull Run in August of that same year. June 1862 saw Lincoln appear one day in the old War Department building. He asked for some paper and said he had something special to write. Then the president sat at a desk, holding pen against his cheek and looking out the window. He did not seem to do much writing. For days, Lincoln returned at intervals to resume his work, and at night, what he had written was locked in a desk where it could not be read. Always, the composition came slowly. Lincoln chatted at times with the telegraph operators or gazed with fascination at a spider web. Some days he seemed most interested in reading what he had written and filling the margins with question marks. In his inaugural address, the president had said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Now, Lincoln had changed his mind. Doubtless, military considerations led the president to go day after day to the old desk, working slowly and thoughtfully at the writing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, once the slaves were proclaimed free, foreign powers could not very well aid the South, and thus sanction an institution now generally condemned by mankind. However, Lincoln felt he could not issue his proclamation until the North could claim a military victory. On September 17th and 18th, 1862, at Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, the Union Army threw back Lee's first attempt to invade the North. And this bloody battle gave Lincoln the opportunity he sought. On September 22nd came the first indication of his intention. A warning, really, to the South of what was in store if it persisted in the war. On January 1st, 1863, the proclamation was issued, declaring that all slaves in the states then in rebellion are henceforward shall be free. Actually, the Emancipation Proclamation, applying only to those states fighting the federal government, freed few slaves. But it won great respect for the North with foreign nations and led in time to the adoption of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, whereby slavery everywhere in the country was abolished. The war, however, went on grimly, and the shadows around Lincoln's eyes, the lines in his grave face, deepened. December 13th, 1862, saw Lee retrieve his initiative, lost at Antietam with a smashing victory at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Again, in early May of 1863, Lee forced the Union out of Virginia with another crushing victory at Chancellorsville. Lincoln's despair was understandable. The fighting force Lee was defeating time and time again was the Army of the Potomac, and on paper, North America had never known a greater concentration of power. At full strength, 125,000 men fought with the Army of the Potomac. Whenever the army moved, it was as though a city like Albany or Columbus or Indianapolis had arisen one morning and walked away complete in every detail: clothing, food, medicine, ammunition, horses, wagons, people. Lincoln still looked for a general who could win. Lee, emboldened, moved into Pennsylvania, threatening both Washington and Philadelphia. The Army of the Potomac, under still another general, George G. Meade, pursued the wily Virginian and at last caught up with him at Gettysburg. For the first 3 days of July 1863, the hills and ridges south of Gettysburg shook with the roar of savage battle before Lee, defeated, lumbered back to Virginia. Meade failed to pursue the fleeing Confederates. He was not the general Lincoln needed. The North, wildly celebrating the victory at Gettysburg, received the following day the equally jubilant news that Grant had captured Vicksburg. And, as Lincoln would say, the Mississippi now could flow unvexed to the sea, meaning there was nothing blocking the Mississippi. The Southerners could no longer go to the Mississippi in order to get their soldiers and ammunition along the river. Everyone believed that these two victories in the East and West must end the war. But Johnny Reb tightened his belt. He seemed madder than ever. But July had produced one climactic result. In Ulysses S. Grant, the North had produced the general that Lincoln wanted. He fights, the president said, paying him a commander-in-chief's highest tribute. That he fights. That was the good words that Abe Lincoln had to say about him. On November 19th, 1863, a military cemetery was dedicated at Gettysburg. Edward Everett, perhaps the country's most polished orator, was to give the main address. Lincoln to speak but briefly. It is untrue that Lincoln scribbled his remarks in a few moments. The president pondered deeply what he would say. Why did we fight this war? What did it mean? Lincoln said, you can say it with me if you have it memorized, 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.